And hopefully Elijah Hundley will join us soon, but why don't we go ahead and get started? So welcome everyone to this afternoon session of Theorizing World Literature today. We have four panelists who will be talking to us about projects across disciplines. I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody's work. Our first presenter is going to be Ben Watson from McNeese State University. Ben Watson is a third-year MFA fiction candidate at McNeese State University who served as the managing editor for the McNeese Review. His short fiction has appeared in Apricity, Tiny Molecules, Halfway Down the Stairs, and Wilderness House magazines. Watson's talk today will be Resurrecting the Dead Author, exploring process-based approaches to creative pedagogy to provide better mentorship for writers.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and get started. The realms of creative writing and critical analysis are treated with little, if any, separation in many academic settings. Creative writing departments were more often than not conceived, born, and brought up in literature departments where literary theory is often mandatory for literature students. The notion that creative writing and literary analysis ought to be joined primarily stems from the notion that good readers will naturally be good at writing, and that training an individual to read is tantamount to training them to write. A primary difference between the creative writer and the literary critic, however, is the process each must undergo. Literary theorists analyze existing text as readers. This approach provides almost no insight into the actual processes that writers underwent in order to create said texts. At best, insight into an author's creative process is often viewed as interesting but superfluous information, and at worst, it is an unwelcome distraction from the process of literary analysis. Most English programs offer extensive coursework meant to instruct students on how to create processes which will help them analyze text and construct argumentation surrounding it. Creative writers who have been lumped in with English academics are rarely afforded that same luxury for their creative processes. In this educational climate, it is no surprise that many writers question the efficacy of creative pedagogy within higher education. Through analysis of more than 200 pages of interviews from the Paris Review, Dively finds that, quote, the interviews contain extensive conversation about the efficacy of teaching creative writing. Those who question the validity of creative writing courses believe that formal instruction is of no aid to art. There's a strong argument to be made that the way creative writing programs ignore authors and their processes heavily contributes to the notion that writing itself cannot be taught. While some might argue that processes are not taught because they cannot be effectively taught, the lack of attention existing programs place on the process itself suggests that it is likely the other way around. Individuals believe that processes cannot be taught because they are not currently being taught effectively. This paper posits that authors' distrust in creative writing programs demonstrates the gap in creative writing pedagogy, which is caused by lumping authors in with literary theorists. The text-centered approaches to literary theory that literary theory emphasizes ultimately fail to serve many writers. Attempting to mentor writers by helping them develop individualized processes could serve a wider pool of authors and improve the experience of people who seek to further their writing capabilities through higher education. Several critics have pointed out the flaws and shortcomings in lumping creative writers in with English academics. In his examination on how literary theory has shaped educational settings, Hellstrom argues that the author's process has been removed from analysis in favor of critical textual examination. He writes much of literary criticism and theory, at least since Russian formalism in the 1920s, has more or less explicitly eliminated the author as a creative subject and replaced him or her with a textual focus. Much of this attack on the author as a creative subject seems to be based on confounding the author as a historical concrete person with the author as an artistic function who is concretized in textual expression. Harris from Sheffield Hallam University argues against the fixation on text. The net result of literary theoretical movement to empower the reader at the expense of the writer was the serious neglect of subjects and sources that might have challenged the strange notion that reading was really writing, that consumption was really production. The work of other scholars suggests that creative writing academics would be far better off rejecting most aspects of literary theory and considering instead a completely different body of systemic cogitation. Harris discusses in depth the rise of new criticism and the removal of an author's process from creative consideration. He builds upon the work of theorists such as Sean Burke, Timothy Clark, and Jack Sillinger to establish how process-based approaches and authorial understanding have been removed in favor of critical reading techniques. While Hellstrom argues for an approach which synthesizes text-based and process-based examination, Harris instead posits that theory could provide a better approach to creative pedagogy in higher education. Though the bulk of Harris's analysis on this subject is spent outlining the shortcomings of creative research and the potential pitfalls of such an approach. Harris is not the only scholar to discuss issues with creativity theory and its utilization within educational concepts. A manifesto compiled by several creative scholars points out that a challenge for the cultural socio approach to creativity is to weave together various dimensions which have historically been studied in isolation or even in opposition to each other, and to address the disciplinary, philosophical, cultural, and political reason for these oppositions. Lubert, in a detailed analysis of various modes of creativity theory, agrees, stating that theories of the creative process need to specify in much greater detail how the sub-processes could be sequenced to yield creative productions. Thus, creative writers are left at an impasse. Text-based approaches for creative writers are viewed as flawed because they don't respect the actual process of creation, while process-based approaches are viewed as flawed due to their lack of universality and conclusive research. This paper attempts to bridge this impasse by first deconstructing the critiques authors have made against writing programs, and then by proposing a wider focus on mentorship through process-based thinking rather than focus on a specific process, thus allowing for more adaptability and diversity in the approaches taken to creative writing pedagogy. This paper leans on Dively's examination of the Paris Review interviews of well renowned authors in order to determine the perspectives of creatives within an academic space. Within the Paris Review interviews, several authors express a strong sense of opposition to existing creative pedagogy. One of the most ardent critics was James Cain, who stated, "This bunkum and stinkum of college creative writing courses. The academics don't know the only thing you can do for someone who wants to write is buy him a typewriter." Francis Gilbert also expressed a lack of faith in educational systems. When asked if his schooling influenced him as a writer, Gilbert said, "No, I failed high school. I got into college by mistake. I failed freshman English 8 times. I was interested in learning, but I wanted to understand too, which meant I was fighting with the teachers all the time." Alice Munro, when asked if she enjoyed teaching fiction, replied, "No, it was terrible. It didn't seem to have anything to do with writing, more like good training for going into television or something, getting really comfortable with cliches." Richard Price also agreed, expressing that the things which fuel creative writing are difficult to convey, leading to a lack of trust in the notion of teaching it. Jeanette Winterson directly addresses a lack of process emphasis by stating, "The funny thing about creative writing courses is that they busily rush around teaching people how to express their banalities without teaching them how to source the things they need to discover." Within each of these oppositional accounts, there are certain commonalities among the complaints. Many authors complained about a sense of elitism or exclusion centered around heavy abstraction and the rejection of diversity. Winterson critiques the class-based difficulties directly by saying, "Whatever people say, working class women don't get on in this job. If they do, where are they? People can't understand what it means to come from a house with no books and no bathroom, no encouragement and no education." Monroe writes that when she started teaching, "My class was all male except for one girl who hardly got to speak." Several authors also describe becoming weighed down by the constant expectation to read and critique student work. Price expressed frustration with having to manage writers through assignments, stating, "I hated giving assignments. I hated getting them and I hated giving them." And he furthered his distaste by repeating the following quote, which he claims was from Tom McGuane: "I've done a lot of horrible things in my life, but I've never taught creative writing." T.S. Eliot furthers a distaste for institutional instruction by stating, "I think it's awfully dangerous to give general advice. I think nothing is worse than trying to form people in your own image." In many ways, these complaints seem to converge on a common sentiment that authors felt ignored and separate from a larger body of work. Creative writing pedagogy is often depicted as a machine which doesn't allow for the free expression, growth, and engagement which would help writing flourish. Ignoring the author in favor of the text not only isolates the author from their community and even their own work, it generalizes the author by passing their work through the same literary lenses applied to all other work. The critical deconstruction of creative fiction is a one size fits all approach to an infinitely diverse variety of authors, whose creative processes often don't benefit from the cold clinical examination that literary theory is prone to providing. While several facets contribute to authors' disdain for writing programs, current practices which center on uniform deconstruction rather than individualized support hold particular blame for the negative experience so many authors report having. Despite these heavy criticisms, author interviews also discuss the virtues of advice and mentorship. Kane describes Vincent Lawrence as a big influence who had more effect on my writing than anyone else. Kane also credited Phil Goodman and Bob Riskin as important influences on his writing. Eliot expressed a deep gratitude to his editor Ezra Pound, who he described as a marvelous critic because he didn't try to turn you into an imitation of himself. He tried to see what you were trying to do. Eliot also describes a particular high school teacher whose encouragement helped him continue writing. William Styron and John Ashbery also voiced appreciation for the motivating, confidence building impact of creative writing teachers. In educational roles, several authors observed that their students grew notably from their time within the programs. Despite his misgivings on education, Price shared a story about helping a student create more authentic work. He said, "Oftentimes it's a matter of lining up the archer with the target." Author interviews seem to draw a hard line between the notion of being taught creative writing in a formal academic setting and the notion of being influenced or helped by someone who acts as a mentor. This mentor figure often helps students figure out, as Price puts it, what they think they should be writing about. Mentor figures help writers cope with the constant negativity surrounding their choice of career, not only the statistical improbability of landing their work in print, but also the skepticism of family and friends. The mentor figure is less concerned with bringing the work to some theoretical claim of excellence, and more concerned with helping an author fulfill their own vision of their own process. Descriptions of this mentor figure, however, seem fully incompatible with text based approaches that creative writing academia favors. Whereas the mentor figure is primarily concerned with helping the author establish a process which will allow the author to produce work they are most pleased with, a more text based approach is solely concerned with dissecting the work an author has already produced. The author's goals, vision, and process become ancillary to the text, and the work the authors put forth and analyze is dissected and categorized as though the author themselves doesn't exist. In such an educational climate, the author is so unimportant for the purposes of textual analysis that they are effectively rendered silent and dead. It is no small wonder that authors who experienced this called for the total rejection of any sort of writing instruction, even while acknowledging the beneficial role of mentorship. There is an obvious gap in the way that creative pedagogy in higher education serves the authors who engage with it. If instructors are to view a student's fulfillment of their own individual vision as the highest priority, then it is not possible to objectively assess the merit of any creative content. Further, there is no singular process which can be taught, which, when followed, would allow for each individual author to write effectively in his or her own aesthetic. The gap in academia centered around text based approaches ultimately boils down to a singular issue of author treatment. By removing the author from consideration, particularly when said author is the very person a creative program ought to be serving, the author ultimately does not receive the respect and support they require in order to effectively develop their own individual processes for creative cogitation. Systems which consider the needs of the piece above the needs of the author may shed an interesting critical light upon the pieces which they examine, but it is no surprise that they leave authors feeling as though their needs have not been served. In the absence of research which would provide a more specific pedagogical suggestion to solve this problem, this essay advocates for the following considerations as an attempt to resurrect respect for the author which text based approaches have effectively killed. First, acknowledgement that behind every creative piece exists a creative author who underwent a creative process. Second, respect that each author is capable of producing their own creative process, and that authors, while often being willing to receive inspiration and insight from others, are the sole arbiters of their creative process. Third, commitment to emphasize exploration into process over exploration into text, paying particular attention to helping authors achieve their goals rather than imposing goals onto an author's existent text. And fourth, concentrated effort to root out the elitist assumptions made about authors because they have less experience in or place less emphasis on textual examination, and to remove judgment from authors because they do not focus as deeply on producing text which conforms to external notions of literary merit. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really interested in hearing a bit more about your experiences with regards to creative writing pedagogy and kind of reconciling those two worlds of the creative and academic space. Our next presenter will be Elijah Hundley, presenting A Life of Casual Sex and Casual Violence, a cultural analysis of violence in Otaro Maijo as Asura Girl. Elijah Hundley, a current English literature graduate student at SUNY Buffalo State University, is an enthusiast of anime, manga, video games, and otaku culture. His work focuses on exploring the intersection of storytelling, identity, and cultural influence within these mediums. Hundley holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from SUNY Buffalo State.
Yep. Hello, nice to meet you all. Can you all hear me? All right, sweet. Okay, I'll jump right in. Otaro Maijo's Asura Girl was published in 2003 and upon release saw acclaim due to the innovative style of Maijo's prose. Through the use of slang with the common with the time, colloquially referred to as girl talk, Maijo made a schoolgirl protagonist stand out enough to be nominated and eventually win the Mishima Yukio Prize for literature in the same year. The Mishima Prize is highly competitive and seeks to award prose that, quotes, breaks the new ground for the future of literature. However, despite the acclaim Maijo was receiving for his award, there was a pushback against him receiving it. A prominent author, Miyamoto Teru, said that he did not deserve the reward due to the vulgar and filthy sentences, and that the work was not at a stage in which to show people. while still winning the award at the end, defended by other authors such as Fukuda Kazuya and Masahiko Shimada. This reaction to Maijo's work is one consistently levied at him even beyond Ashura Girl. This is because Maijo does not let up when it comes to his use of crude language, shown from the very opening of the novel. Ashura Girl opens on confusion and regret. Our protagonist Aiko, out of a drunken stupor, declares she has lost self-respect for having sex with a classmate, Akihiko Sano. She recalls doing this only because of classmates saying that he was good with his technique, despite him often being made fun of for his micro-penis. However, Aiko is not impressed with his porn star techniques or his apparently creepy penis. And after almost becoming a victim to a cum shot to the face, she kicked him square in the nose. Afterwards, guided by the voice of LL Cool J, she sprints out of the love hotel she was at, mortified. Maijo's novel opens undiluted and filled with the eccentricities criticized by Miyamoto Teru. This is shown in the way Aiko speaks about the situation in exclamatory terms. Quote, creepy, hard, bent out of shape or something, and it was inside me, ew, end quote, to her prolific use of colorful language such as asshole and you don't come on a classmate's face. Furthermore, you'll often see English words used in conjunction with Japanese in the original text, such as watashi wa mada oke, showing a unification between both English and Japanese, which was common at the time. From the beginning, Maijo immediately captures a different from ideal Japan, one that is rife with casual sex and casual violence. The pushback Maijo received for the award being representative of an urge to reject this notion of Japan. While Aiko is crude and violent, she is this way to capture a more turbulent image of Japan, in particular a sense of social collapse. Born in 1973, Maijo was privy to many of the impactful events that affected Japan, in particular events such as the bubble economy and its burst, leading to what is known as the Ushinawareta Junin, or the Lost Decades. This economic decline creating a sense of precarity that is still felt in Japan to this day, enough that the lost decade became the lost decades. In Anne Allison's Precarious Japan, published in 2013, say Japan had the second highest poverty rate at 15.3%, only beaten by the United States with 17.1%. According to the OECD, this number having increased to 15.4% as of 2021. The result of this precarity was an increase in violence in Japan. One example Allison provides was a series of copycat killings in Akihabara. Quote, the last attack was committed by a 79-year-old homeless woman who said her motive was to be carted to prison where she could find shelter and food. Furthermore, this is not the only event that would affect Maijo and his generation. Highlighted by Takashi Kitamura, events like the Great Hashin earthquake further revealed there was a sense of social collapse. Returning to Allison's writing, she discusses an article covering this increase in deaths after the Hashin earthquake. There was more than 900 suicides from people living in temporary shelters. Furthermore, the article asserts this is not unique, stating that 10 people in Tokyo die of a lonely death, or kodokushi, every day. In essence, people felt estranged from each other due not only to their economic conditions, but a sense of loneliness as well. Ashura Girl seeks to put this on display through the anxiety of the times, through representative rhetoric of popular culture in Japan. Additionally, Maijo provides a model on how to fight back against the growing cynicism and estrangement felt at this time. Maijo seeks to push the envelope with Ashura Girl through Aiko. This is not just through the use of language, but also her position as a schoolgirl. Outlined thoroughly in Sharon Kinsella's Schoolgirls, Money, and Rebellion in Japan is a discourse around the idea that the youth, specifically schoolgirls, are corrupt and acting inappropriately, and this media was prolifically produced during the 1990s to 2000s. According to Kinsella, this is due to both the media delight and panic surrounding delinquent prostitute schoolgirls. This centered heavily around enjo kosai, or compensated dating, the act of older men paying schoolgirls for money/prostitution. While enjo kosai does not specifically show up in the novel, and the validity of these claims of how rampant it was also called into question by Kinsella, Maijo does tap into the sensationalized sexuality that was surrounding schoolgirls during the 90s, hitting the audience over the head with it from the opening chapters. Furthermore, media commenting on these topics were not as new as Kinsella, were not new, as Kinsella also notes how schoolgirls being a symbol of rebellion was common during the 90s to early 2000s. Prominent works featuring this were Ito Shunya's Female Convict Scorpion series, Harada Matsuo's Bounce Cool Gal, and Mike Takashi's Audition. Also important to note is how it was framed that schoolgirls rebelled using Enjo Kosai and sexuality, where writers like Kurunomo Katsushi, Miyada Shinji, and Ueno Chizuko all say that the act of these schoolgirls asserting sexual autonomy as a form of rebellion to established norms. Aiko smoothly fits into this archetype of schoolgirl not only through her casual use of sex, but also her immediate assertion of autonomy upon deciding not wanting to be with Sano, hence the quick kick in the face. In fact, this evokes a similar scene from the aforementioned Bounce Cool Gals. One of the characters, Lisa, gives the illusion she'll sell her body before getting the money and tasing the man who had bought her. In essence, Maijo uses Aiko to tap into the cultural discourse surrounding the schoolgirl, and while Aiko embodies many of the tropes surrounding these works at the times, she is also framed as lost herself while surrounded by violence. You can see this following the event at the Love Hotel, when Aiko, struggling through the emotions, often uses media as a way to interpret her situation. Heavily regretting her decision to sleep with Sano, after a bath decides to do a form of self-therapy by imagining herself in another world. Quote, "Today I'm Kirsten, one of my very favorite people." Kirsten has some simple advice for Aiko Katsura in Tokyo as well. "Aiko, sweetheart, sleeping with people you don't like just makes you lonelier. Fake warmth from a body that means nothing only makes you colder." Kirsten, among other figures, act as a recurring character for Aiko throughout the story, often used to help her interpret the scenarios she finds herself in. These characters take on a more significant role in part 2 of the story, after Aiko endures more violence at her school. The second chapter of the novel opens on the next day with Aiko observing a fight happening at her school. Quote, "Urayasu went on thrashing Nizaki mercilessly. For whatever reason, he seemed to want to beat the last piece of shit out of him. The voices urging him on trailed off. It was getting a little scary, and Nizaki looked pretty awful, wonderfully so." End quote. The fight continues with no one wanting to stop due to the one being beaten, Nizaki being an infamous bully in the school. Hence Aiko's comments that he looks beaten wonderfully so. The students around the fight continue to encourage the violence until a new character is introduced, Yoji Kaneda. Aiko describes him as unassuming, but quickly is able to diffuse the fights between the two. After getting Urayasu to stop, he leans over to Nizaki, checking on him. Nizaki, baffled, says, "Leave me alone. What do you think this is?" Yoji replies with, "It's love." Love is a central theme to this work, as well as central to Maijo's works as a whole. In Asura Girl specifically, it is presented as a solution to the violence that occurs within the novel. This is represented thoroughly not only in Yoji's consistently empathetic approach towards others in the novel, but even the semantics such as Aiko's name being spelled with the kanji for love or I. Yet despite this irony, Aiko herself states, quote, "But I seem to have a little deficit where the love is concerned. And as sure as hell, I'm never going to save my world, at least not like this," end quote. What's being highlighted here is the fights at the beginning, as well as Aiko's diatribe here is a lack of love, or to be more specific, a lack of proper connection with people. Spaces such as a school in this scenario no longer feel like places where one can participate in learning and other communal activities, but instead are tense, where violence can break out at any moment, and that violence is encouraged by the other students. Maijo demonstrates this further in the next chapter. Aiko is brought to the girls' bathroom by several of her friends. Confused by this, they begin asking her questions about the boy she slept with last night, Sano. When Aiko asks why she's being interrogated, the leader Maki slaps her, causing Aiko to fight back. Quote, "I grabbed her hair and smashed my knee into her pretty face over and over. I saw something red on the bathroom tiles and knew Maki was bleeding from her nose, but I kept on cracking her face against my knee." While viciously beating her former friend, Aiko continues to rather casually think about what they are planning to do to her. These group attacks, colloquially referred to as death penalties, are common and given multiple names. Whether named the crucifixion, butt drill tour, or safety pin tattoo, Aiko can only feel safe if she attacks them before they attack her. According to Yoneyama and Naito, discussions around bullying in schools in Japan started around 1984 to 85 upon 16 students committing suicide due to it. Maijo here now taps into that same discussion to show how the school is also a precarious space prone to violence. Additionally, this scene highlights the nature of this social decline. People feel as if they cannot talk to each other, places where conversation could have been used to resolve the situation, such as Aiko attacking Maki or Urayasu attacking Nizaki, were instead approached with violent action. These microaggressions Maijo established throughout the work set up for the central conflict of the narrative, the serial killings of the round and round devil. The reason the girls had cornered Aiko so aggressively is because she was the last one to see Sano before he had disappeared, the last thing seen of him being his big toe, which was sent to his family alongside demands of ransom. The one blamed for this murder is the Round and Round Devil, a serial killer that had been plaguing the area for some time, being connected to the murder of several children. The Round and Round Devil, later given the name Hideo, similar to Aiko, mirrors the cultural events at the time, the closest connection being the murders of Miyazaki Tsutomu. He was a serial killer that had murdered 4 girls, mutilated their corpses, and used them to taunt the families. Due to the severity of these crimes, he had caught much attention from the media and later became dubbed as the Otaku Murderer due to his collection of horror films, anime, and ero manga. Furthermore, shown in Joran Olkam's opening of the Black Box of 1989 Otaku Discourse, the Miyazaki incident was used as a stepping stone towards framing otaku as a larger systematic issue to create moral panic. While references to anime are brief in Asura Girl, Maijo makes more explicit references to it later in his short story Drill Hole in My Brain, and has worked on several anime and manga such as Bjorg Trinity, Spotless Love, and Id Invaded. Similar to Miyazaki, Hideo is also known not only for murdering children, but also manipulating their bodies in order to create his own Asura. Furthermore, Hideo's family life mirrors Miyazaki in that both characters feel ostracized from their family and others. The biggest departure between Miyazaki and Hideo would be that the latter is not stated to be an otaku, though he does refer to anime at times. Instead, the focus is put on Hideo and his isolation from others. Towards the end of the novel, we see Hideo's family life. Living only with his mother, he remains mainly at home. Whenever needing to go outside, he forces his mother to go out for him, such as in the opening scene, where he forces his mom to go out to a 7-Eleven for curry. Hideo is cruel to his mother, insulting her with words such as fat bitch or lazy sloth, and when she doesn't move fast enough for his taste, Hideo beats her. Quote, whoa, ashtray landed right on the bitch's head. Ash and shit everywhere. Least it got her out the fucking door. End quote. Hideo puts himself in a position of power over his mother, further reinforced on his insistence to call him Mr. Hideo or Hideo-san, a more formal honorific to keep power over his mother. However, she is the only person he interacts with directly, and other than that, he keeps himself mostly in his room. This dynamic is reminiscent of hikikomori or NEETs, not in education, employment, or training, a trend that had a rise in discussion in the 90s upon the release of Saito Tamiki's Hikikomori, Adolescence Without End. In this work, he defines the shut-in epidemic, explaining how it came from the stress adolescents are feeling in school and family life. Throughout the book, he goes over cases he has dealt with, one chapter going over violence in the family. Quote, the person in withdrawal was the family's firstborn son, and he had been engaging in violent outbursts for over 10 years. The sole targets of his outbursts were his mother and his brother. Any number of small incidents could trigger him. His mother might start preparing a meal too late. His brother might refuse to play a video game with him. These would be enough to send him into a violent rage. What is worse, his mother experienced a series of bruises and open wounds that hardly had a chance to heal before the next ones would come along, end quote. While not one for one, the dynamic we see between Hideo and his mother is reminiscent of what Tamaki describes here. The biggest difference being Tamaki's patience would feel remorse for the violence, bursting into tears and apologizing, whereas Hideo clearly takes joy in the violence he inflicts upon his mother. What Maijo highlights is not only the increase in hikikomori, tapping into the imagery in Tamaki's work, but unapologetically shows the violence that can be possible in these situations. Hideo becomes representative of a collapse of the family structure and resulting violence that can come from a lack of familial support. Asura Girl is the amalgamation of various areas of discourse that had begun in Japan between the 90s and early 2000s, with the discourse in question centering around violence. The novel puts this on display throughout within various spaces, from rampant school bullying to murders to the domestic. Maijo frames Japan as a precarious space where social connections have dwindled. However, despite this precarious picture painted by Ashura Girl, Maijo still seeks to offer a framework for people to have connections and be able to endure despite the violence. We can see a solution play out in part 3 of the text. Just to quickly summarize, Aiko at this point in the novel had been attacked by Maki for revenge for Aiko attacking her. The result of this is the barrier between reality and fiction for her to break. This leads into the most chaotic part of the novel, where Aiko runs through a fictional version of Japan where she is guided through a citywide riot. Afterwards, in the chapter titled The Cliffs, Yoji attempts to save Aiko, but fails, and she instead regresses further into her own fiction. During the chapter titled The Forest, Aiko fully disassociates from reality, becoming Kirsten, the character she seeks advice from in the beginning. In essence, Aiko admits to violence, seeks to escape into fiction as a comfort. However, she's able to be reached out to thanks to the efforts of not only Yoji, but another character named Tansetsu. Labeled as an otaku, he acts as a key role towards helping Aiko come back to reality post her psychic break. Aiko describes the experience as thus, quote, I remember those cliffs. Written was a message for me. Aiko, come back. And I looked up and there was a weird Tanetsu Sakurazuki waving at me from the top of the cliff, grinning for all he was worth, as though he was really, really happy to see me. And it was the kindness in that smile that brought me back to this side. What Maijo shows in these final scenes is how kindness can still bring someone back from that brink of despair. Even among these socioeconomic crises, there can still be a space for connection. One of those spaces can be among the fellow estranged. Maijo places the process of dealing with precarity through solidarity. By consistently reaching out to others, bonds can still be found during turbulent times like these through the margins, hopefully acting as a vehicle to find a better tomorrow. I am finished.
Thank you so much. That is an awfully spooky kind of novel with a lot of violence, but I think you really touched on the way it is this social commentary. I look forward to hearing more in the Q&A. Our next presenter will be Jenna Albergo from Florida State University. Jenna Albergo is a PhD student studying literature, media, and culture with a concentration in post-1900 literary and cultural studies at Florida State University. Jenna received her BA and MA in English Language and Literature from Florida Gulf Coast University and has recently presented her research at venues including the South Atlantic Modern Language Association Conference, the 32nd Annual International Conference on Virginia Woolf, the Sigma Tau Delta Southern Regional Conference, and the Florida College Learning Center Association Conference. Jenna's research interests include 20th century British and Anglophone literature, global modernisms, and post-colonial theory. She will be presenting The Truth Shall Set You Free, reading the role of testimony and self-disclosure on identity production in the African Bildungsroman. Thank you, Jenna.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. Okay, so as stated, my paper is titled The Truth Shall Set You Free, reading the role of testimony and self-disclosure on identity production in the African Bildungsroman. The literary genre of the European Bildungsroman tracks the formative experiences that comprise the coming of age of a young subject from the innocence of childhood through the challenges of navigating entry into adulthood. For Franco Moretti, the Bildungsroman, or novel of development, encompasses the symbolic form of modernity, and he interprets that the conventions of this genre form, quote, a specific image of modernity, the image conveyed precisely by the youthful attributes of mobility and inner restlessness, unquote. These attributes of mobility and restlessness take on a special significance for the coming of age of the African child, for whom modernity often signifies a clash between traditional and Western epistemologies brought to Africa with the arrival of European colonizers. According to Erica A. Hoagland, the post-colonial Bildungsroman presents the direct impact of the legacy of colonialism on the coming of age of post-colonial subjects, and she remarks that the post-colonial Bildungsroman is characterized by the, quote, ongoing remediation of colonialism's traumatic legacy throughout the self-maturation process, unquote. By presenting the impact of colonial and Western influences on the psyche of the developing child, African writers recruit and repurpose the Bildungsroman to comment upon how Western and colonial institutions directly intervene in the self-fashioning attempts of young post-colonial subjects. In African literature, the coming-of-age novel centralizes the formation of identity and selfhood through acts of testimony. Acts of testimony empower young people to articulate and make meaning of their experience as post-colonial subjects, and, if read as a testimonial genre, the African Bildungsroman bears witness to the particular impacts of colonization on the personal development of the African child. In the outwardly disparate texts Mating Birds by Lewis Cossey and The Icarus Girl by Helen Oyeyemi, the novelist critique the impact of Western legal and medical institutions' intrusion, respectively, on the identity formation of post-colonial subjects. However, each writer remains insistent upon the promise of personal testimony as a tool to subvert or disrupt the authority of these institutions, namely by illustrating the productive potential of oral and written personal accounts as sites of resistance. In the novel Mating Birds, Lewis Cossey comments upon the injustice of apartheid through the narrative of a Black man who is wrongfully convicted of raping a white woman in apartheid-era South Africa. the novel begins by introducing Nadi Sabia, the narrator of the novel, in his prison cell waiting to be executed by hanging for his purported crime. Cosi destabilizes the conventions of the Bildungsroman to examine how discriminatory institutions distort the self-fashioning attempts of post-colonial subjects by presenting the fragmented psyche of his protagonist as a symptom of the societal affliction of apartheid. As Apollo Amako notes, quote, the term Bildungsroman refers to a so-called novel of formation, that is, a fictional account tracing, usually in the first person, the spiritual, moral, psychological, or social growth of a fictional protagonist, typically from childhood to maturity, unquote. Whereas, by starting at the end and moving between temporalities and genres of storytelling, Cosi invokes questions of the meaning of truth and who constructs the dominant narrative. In Mating Birds, Cosi repurposes and reinvents the conventions of the genre of the Bildungsroman by depicting Sabia's often desperate attempts to reclaim the agency to produce and control his narrative, and by extension his identity, through the affordances of his memory and acts of testimony. In Mating Birds, Cosi represents how Sabia's identity is shaped by the self-narration he engages in within his prison diary to demonstrate the relationship between acts of disclosure and identity production. The effect of Sabia's acts of disclosure are alluded to through his own comments on the transformative potential of writing as both a method of self-assertion in the face of condemnation and as a way of making intelligible his experiences as a Black man living under the system of apartheid. On the relationship between writing and identity production, Sabia remarks, quote, a great discipline, writing, one might even say it is character forming, were the observation not likely to sound a trifle odd in the mouth of one already condemned to hang, unquote. Here, the character-forming potential of writing is twofold. Literally, it allows Sabia the opportunity to construct his identity through the act of autobiography, to shape his character as it will be understood by future readers, and secondarily, to make meaning of his own identity, a fact he recognizes when he later states, quote, I have tried to explain as much to myself as to the hordes of anonymous readers who will read, judge, and accuse me, unquote. In this sense, writing for Cosi is character forming, as it facilitates Sabia's ability to both construct and articulate his identity for an external audience, and to make meaning of his identity through the act of writing, an affordance of testimony described by Fellman and Lobb as, quote, the process of coming to knowledge that we did not consciously possess, unquote. In commenting upon the function of Sabia's narration, Philoma Mozito remarks, quote, firstly, it shows the narrator as the main voice of the story in which every action is subject to his point of view, and secondly, it identifies the narrator as the subject of his own story, unquote. As a result of his combined roles as composer and subject, the text is both a narration of the self and an outlet for Sabia to gain intelligibility within his circumstances. Through the forms of disclosure present in the novel, Cosi explores the risks and affordances inherent in the act of testimony to examine how testimonials both facilitate the identity production of the South African subject and are simultaneously subject to the interpretation by the same colonial-era institutions that they are self-fashioning against. As Apollo Amako describes, the genre of the African Bildungsroman affords, quote, critique of the past and present and offers alternative futures, unquote. The alternative future offered by Cosi's Bildungsroman is not located in the potential of the novel's narrator, who is condemned to death, but rather in the text itself, the prison diary that Sabia presupposes will be disseminated amongst hordes of anonymous readers. The promise in Sabia's act of testimony derives from his ability to historicize his experience for an external audience. Quote, I spend my last days in meditation. I hope to preserve these fruits of self-scrutiny for posterity on cheap, unimpressive notebook paper with which I have been provided by the authorities in order to write the story of my life, unquote. Sabia's underlying concern with legacy, revealed through his hope for preservation of his diary, which is evidently realized, reflects the project of creating a more just future, a central concern of the African Bildungsroman. However, neither Sabia nor Cosi are ignorant to the risks inherent in self-fashioning on the public stage. Sabia's narrative will always be subject to the scrutiny of society and pseudoscientific institutions, as demonstrated through the plans of Swiss psychiatrist Dr. Dufray to revise and publish Sabia's prison interviews. As Dufray describes, quote, upon his arrival in Zurich, he will write up his memories of the place, his careful analysis, his daring interpretations, all devoted to the reconstruction of a fractured personality, unquote. By alluding to the intended dissemination of Dr. Dufresne's and Sabia's own juxtaposing accounts of Sabia's identity, Cosi presents the political utility of the personal account for the oppressed South African subject as not exclusively an act of self-fashioning, but as negating or challenging the gaze of post-colonial institutions which aim to justify their oppressive practices. Louis Cosi's recruitment of multiple forms of disclosure to capture the impact of unjust institutions on the identity formation of Black South African subjects in mating birds presents a generative framework through which to interpret Helen Oyeyemi's exploration of the role of testimony and identity production in her novel The Icarus Girl. In the novel, 8-year-old Jessamy Harrison lives in England with her Nigerian English mother and English father. When Jess's family takes a trip to Nigeria, her life changes when she meets a young girl named Tilly Tilly, who's not actually a girl at all, but a presence from the spirit world. Jess's interactions with Tilly ultimately reveal her true relation to Jess as a wayward spirit of Jess's twin sister, who passed away in infancy, further initiating Jess's cross-cultural and transnational reckoning with identity and search for intelligibility, which she is unable to realize in England alone. In the Icarus Girl, Jess's therapy sessions with Dr. Mackenzie are legible as a central site of testimony in the novel, as here she seeks to gain intelligibility from the Western psychiatric institution, though to notably limited avail. Reading Jess's psychology session as both an interview and what Roseanne Kennedy describes as a psychoanalytic encounter makes this space comprehensible as a site of testimony, which Jess seeks to create a sense of wholeness in her identity, which she currently experiences as incomplete. As she states to Tilly, quote, "I don't want to have something missing from me," unquote. Referencing the influence of Oyeyemi's own childhood on the construction of Jess's experience, Christopher Oma remarks, quote, "These are narratives of identification that portray the fragmented nature of a new diasporic identity formation," unquote. This experience of fragmentation leaves Jess at a loss to make meaning of her behavior and identity and seeking a sense of wholeness. When Jess informs Tilly Tilly of her impending therapy session, she reveals her inclination to attend, citing her feelings of incompleteness. Quote, "And I sort of want to go anyway, you know. I suppose I want to go because I'm not very, well, I'm not like Dulcie or Tundi or even Eben. I'm just not," unquote. To Tilly Tilly's reply, "You keep saying something's missing when nothing is." Jess's interest in attending therapy derives from her desire to gain intelligibility and for a place to articulate and make sense of her identity, despite Western epistemologies ultimately not affording her either. Instead, the Western medical institution ultimately makes Jess's identity intelligible by pathologizing her behavior, making meaning of Jess's testimony by classifying her experience within extant categories of psychic illness. By depicting Jess's frustrated attempts to articulate and make sense of her identity within her sessions with psychologist Dr. Mackenzie, Oyeyemi captures the resistance of Jess's attempts to make meaning of her identity as an Abiku child to translate into Western institutional frameworks of meaning-making, and illuminates how these institutions intervene in the coming of age of young diasporic subjects. This resistance places Jess in a state of flux impervious to self-fashioning through the inability of available outlets for identity production offered by Western medicine to validate and accurately capture her experience. Her attempts at meaning-making are frustrated by Dr. Mackenzie's project to rationalize Jess's behavior within the limits of Western behavioral science, ultimately leaving her silenced and distressed. As remarked upon by Uma, quote, "Oyeyemi's novel invites us to consider the tension between the narrative of Abiku as Yoruba myth legend with a particular material culture, and its new diasporic double as a subject of psychoanalytic interpretation, specifically that of dissociative identity disorder," unquote. This struggle is apparent through exchanges between Jess and Dr. Mackenzie. Quote, and this is from Dr. Mackenzie, "I know she's not imaginary. She's real because she's a part of you," unquote. Jess threw up her hands in frustration at his stupidity. She says, "He's not. What's the matter with you?" He began talking to her mother instead. It's possible that Tilly Tilly is an alter ego, though she could also be an internalized imaginary companion, unquote. When Jess articulates to Dr. Mackenzie that Tilly Tilly exists externally to her, the affordance of the testimony act as a coming to knowledge is undermined by his pathologizing gaze. Ultimately, Jess's coming to knowledge through the Testimony Act is halted when Dr. Mackenzie interrupts his dialogue with Jess to give his diagnosis to her mother. Her ability to self-fashion has been compromised by Dr. Mackenzie, leading to her further sense of isolation and fragmentation. As she then reflects, oh God, what if he was right and she was just this mad, mad girl? Oyeyemi's account of Jess's attempts to make meaning of her experiences as an Ibeji and a Biku child ultimately redeems the power of the personal account by functioning as Oyeyemi's own metatextual testimony to the efficacy of non-Western epistemological orientations and to the validity of traditional forms of knowledge. The Icarus Girl is comprehensible as a testimony to the utility of non-Western forms of knowledge by presenting how meaning is only able to be made of Jess's identity once her condition is interpreted within a Yoruba cultural framework. When the Harrison family returns to Nigeria for Jess's birthday, her behavior is initially understood by those around her as uncouth, resulting in condemnation by her family. However, as a practitioner of traditional Yoruba culture, Jess's grandfather, Gabenga, comprehends that she is not simply behaving badly and therefore does not chastise her. Instead, he understands that Jess occupies a spiritual liminal space due to her family's failure to procure an Ibeji carving for Jess's sister Fern, who passed away in infancy, and that resultantly, Jess experiences what Chinyene Akparanta describes as a cultural illness. For this reason, he takes matters into his own hands to resolve Jess's state of liminality, both physically and spiritually, by procuring and bringing her Fern's Ibeji. Akparanta notes, quote, where Sarah Harrison, Jess's mother, after her migration to England, dismisses this age-old Nigerian ritual practice, her daughter's troubled condition criticizes a letting go of heritage and traditional practices, even as transmigration takes one away from the traditional spaces, unquote. Oyeyemi's testimony to the very real psychic and physical implications of Jess's cultural alienation, metaphorized through the effects of the incomplete Ibeji carving, gives credence to the validity of non-Western epistemological orientations and demonstrates how the influences of tradition and modernity impact the identity production and formation of the African child. In the genre of the African Bildungsroman, writers engage with the role of testimony to demonstrate the utility of the testimonial act as a way for post-colonial subjects to gain intelligibility in relation to the traumas they experience at the hands of colonial and Western institutions. Reading the act of testimony according to Feldman and Lom's framework as a process of coming to knowledge that we did not consciously possess provides insight into the relationship between testimony and the coming of age of the African subject as constituting an experiential learning event in which the individual makes meaning of their experience. Simultaneously, Kosi and Oyeyemi recruit the form of the Bildungsroman to attest to the impact of Western institutional contexts on the self-fashioning of the South African and Nigerian subject, respectively, to illuminate the resilience of the African child, for whom the coming of age is not exclusively initiated by a restlessness that emerges internally, as theorized by Moretti, but which responds to and negotiates the role of the self within the institutional contexts that the subject must fashion their identity amongst. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing about both of those novels. I definitely enjoy reading world literature that's about, growing up and navigating different cultures and ethnicities. So that's really interesting.